when you're a pioneer, you're often told you're crazy. Then people see the success of what you're doing, if you're lucky enough to be successful, and then everybody follows.
Ivan, we are so excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us first.
It's a pleasure. It's great to be here. Looking forward to our chat.
Now, we were just chatting. We were saying about kind of humanizing the incredible people behind some of our favorite teams. I'd love to just start on a little bit of context for you. And sorry, this wasn't actually in the schedule, but we were talking about it before. I always believe people are a function of their histories. What do you think you're running from, so to speak, when you think about your history?
Well, I'm not sure I'm running from something, but I was born in South Africa. My father was in jail when I was born because he was an anti-apartheid activist. When he came out of jail, we were exiled effectively as refugees into the United Kingdom, where I grew up, and we arrived with nothing, and had to build a life for ourselves away from family, friends, and everything we had known. That experience, which lives with you for the rest of your life, does inform a lot of the feelings I have about, the values that matter. And,
how old were you then?
So I was about 4 years old when we moved, 5 years old when we moved, and I went back for a year later for 1 year when I was 10. So I've a little bit of South African experience. But the interesting thing for me was, my dad was jailed about the same time as Nelson Mandela. And by the way, even in prison, they segregated the prisoners. So my dad wasn't at Robben Island. He was at another jail in Pretoria. But, and then we grew up, lived our lives in England. But when Nelson Mandela was released in South Africa, my father was allowed back into South Africa for the first time. And I realized at that moment, he went back. And I realized at that moment how he had felt every day of his life that he was away from his home. I knew it intellectually that he was away from his mother. His father had passed away while he was in jail, actually, and he wasn't allowed to the funeral. But at that moment, I really understood emotionally how we'd been, wrenched away. And it's not just your personal experience, I suppose, is what I'm saying. It's kind of that family history, that experience that you collectively have runs with you, actually, and it runs very deep with you.
Can I ask a bit of a weird one? But I obviously interviewed many of the most successful business leaders as well, and one of the biggest commonalities in their upbringings is moving early in their lives. Why do you think that is the case? And do you feel that you benefited from moving early, having to assimilate in different environments at an early age?
I think that's probably true. I was working out, I haven't lived in one place for very long, ever. So London, actually, when I was at Arsenal, we lived in a house for 6 years when I was there. And that's actually the longest I've lived in one house, in one place, in my life. So I wouldn't like to think about it as running away, but I think there is a feeling that, you're always moving. And that has some wonderful aspects to it. I mean, the new experiences, the new challenges, the things that you learn on that journey are amazing. But it also means you don't have that very fixed sense of home, which I envy in other people. So, probably I don't think I could live in that comfortable environment. I was saying before we started that every time I felt comfortable in my life, I've made a big change. And I don't know what's driving me to do that, but there is something clearly.
What took you out to America then? Because you moved, was that right, from the UK?
Yeah. So this is an example. I was working as a lawyer in a London law firm. And, I probably could have done okay at that. But I had the opportunity with a friend to start writing a business plan for a new soccer league in America, which was going to be the league that was supposed to be started around the 1994 World Cup, which was held in the United States. And so I moved out to LA, and I will tell you, most people thought that was insane to do at that time. There was no league. There was an idea that we had There was essentially a blank piece of paper on which to write a business plan for what might get investment for a new league. But soccer had always failed in America. All the leagues had failed, including the NASL with Pelé and so on in the late 70s. So there was nobody jumping up and down saying, we must have a soccer league and I want to invest in it.
Why did you bet your career on it then? Why did you leave a safe job when Pelé can't get a league going? What was like, yep, I'm going to go?
First of all, I love football. I mean, I've played my whole life. I still play whenever I can. I love the sport. So there's just a love of the game. But I think, also it just seemed like such a romantic thing to try and do. And it was with a friend. And it was also really the opportunity to really create something. There was nothing. There was an idea. But beyond that, we were really shaping what that could look like. And, that was really exciting to me. So I didn't have, I didn't have a wife and kids. I always say I get a lot of young people now who come to me and say, look, I'd love to get into the sports business. What do I do? And I sort of say, well, you have time. So I was 28 years old when I did this. There's a little bit of time to work out what it is that's really going to give you energy. And you don't need to work it out when you're 17, 18, 19 years old. Although I think there's a lot of pressure actually on young people to have that worked out. How can they possibly know? You haven't been in the workplace. You haven't seen things. So I only worked it out when I was 28, that this, I'd love to say I had a brilliant plan for my life. I absolutely didn't. A great opportunity fell into my lap, or at least I identified it and made sure it fell into my lap. And I had at least enough good sense to jump on it because I just felt passionately that it was the right thing for me to be involved with.
And how was that MLS proposition different from what had gone before?
Well, we tried to really learn from everything that had happened to the other failures. So we looked at, how sports leagues work. And we created a soccer league, a football league, which was completely different to anything else that had ever existed. So we adopted a very legal structure. It's called a single entity structure, under which it's very centralized with the league. And even all of the players are actually signed by the leagues, and the teams in some sense are like regional offices competing against each other. It's not a romantic structure, but we would never have got investment without a structure that gave strong collective control to the investors, by which I mean, they were able to make decisions collectively on the strategy of the league, and then everybody was bound together in a common kind of success or failure of the league. And what that's enabled MLS to do over the years is to do things like sign Lionel Messi, for example. They can step outside their box and do some special things, and they do it in a way that everybody benefits. And they do it by way of a collective discussion and through a collective strategy. And, as a result of that approach, which gives you tremendous flexibility, you now have a league in the United States that has, I would say, stronger ownership than the Premier League. The MLS teams now, the valuations of those teams are somewhere between $500 million for the new expansion teams to well over $1 billion for the leading teams. Premier League teams are not selling for that outside of the top few teams. Newcastle was, 300 million or so. So MLS has, I think, they have about 25, 26 soccer-specific stadiums, brand new, beautiful stadiums for football. What is it that's driving that type of confidence that those owners have and those investors have in the league to give it that kind of stability? Because it's not, respectfully, it's not at the level of the Premier League on the field. So where is that confidence? Where are those valuations? Where is that optimism coming from? I think it's coming from that collective model that we had set up originally. And what I do know with certainty is there would be no league today if it were not for that model. So it was a necessity to give that kind of those kinds of safety nets. Whereas football around the world is based on the exact opposite, right? It's based on jeopardy. And the jeopardy drives so much of the passion that we see in football. So it's a double-edged sword. I mean, you want that feeling. The perils of winner takes all, relegation, all of these things are amazing, I think, for football fans. But it also leads on the other side of it to, the bankruptcies and a lot of the financial problems we see in football.
Was it obvious that it was working from day one? When we got investment and it was like 94, 95 and things start rolling, was it like, we've got product
Absolutely
market?
Not, no. And it wasn't successful. So, I mean, we launched in 1996. So first of all, it wasn't so easy to get investors. Let's start with that fact. We didn't manage to get investors for all of the teams, for example. The collective model allowed the league to operate some of the teams itself.
How much does one need to start a league investor-wise? I'm a venture capitalist.
So to buy a team at the inception of Major League Soccer cost you $5 million. And now the lowest valued team, I would say, is around $500 million. So they've made...
I'll take one for the original price.
But then on that, was it so did the league own a percentage and then the individual took? Was it a minority investment?
No. So the what you were actually buying was the right to operate a team in a local market and a share in the collective league entity. So you had a share in all the teams, but you were operating a team in your local market and getting a percentage of the local revenues. And then through your shareholding in the league, you were also benefiting from the league-wide revenues. And more or less in very broad terms, the league had a lot of commercial packages, sponsorship packages, and the broadcast deals. And it was the money that the league received from those deals that paid the players. So if you had this local operating right, you were essentially getting your players for free, and then you were generating your local revenues. In the United States, that would be primarily ticket revenue, but also local broadcast revenue and also local sponsorships. And you would be trying to make a profit locally on those while sharing in the growth of the league on the other side. So with no player costs, okay, so it's more or less.
So you did have centralized and more decentralized independent avenues of revenue that allowed some maybe to be more successful.
Yeah, and the beauty of the single entity model is you can calibrate that exactly the way you want it. So you could push 100% of the risk and reward down to the team level, or you could pull 100% back to the league level, and you can have any kind of percentage in any one of these revenue streams between 0 and 100%. But all of those decisions will be made collectively by the ownership group. And the other thing they have in all the US sports leagues, but also in Major League Soccer, is a strong commissioner model. So you have somebody who's very clearly in charge, who is setting the strategic agenda for the league. That's really not the way football is. It's not even clear who's in charge from day to day in most of the world of football, and let alone, is there a clear strategy for the way forward and how we're doing things collectively? That really doesn't exist in football. Football is, strangely, the United States has this sort of socialist model of sports. And the rest of the world is extreme capitalism, I would say.
You take over as a deputy commissioner in 2001. You had 5 years, therefore, of the league running before that. What were the things that you were brought in to change or develop to start making this league what everyone hoped it would be?
Well, look, I had been there from before the inception, right? So there were two of us, literally, and the league grew into this entity that had teams and fans were coming and so on. The pill that was too big to bite off in our original business plan was our belief that you needed to build football stadiums, what we called soccer-specific stadiums. Because the stadiums that existed in the United States were all 70, 80, 90,000 people, and we knew we weren't going to fill those types of stadiums. So what we were saying in the original business plan was, not only buy a share in the league, but build yourself a stadium. And of course, investors thought we were absolutely insane and said, well, we're not going to do that. We're prepared to put in 5 million, but we're not going to put in, 100, 200 million to build a stadium. We had to back away from that in the original business plan. And so we came out of the blocks very strong in 1996. That was our first season. We had some massive attendances. I remember sitting in the Rose Bowl, and they had to close down the freeway because no one had expected that we would get so many fans. People were still trying to get into the stadium with 10 minutes left in the game. So, we weren't really prepared for how much demand there was for this sport in the United States, but we just didn't have the right stadiums. And so over those first 5 years, gradually over time, we had stadiums where you'd have 6 or 7, 8, 10,000 people in a 80,000 seat stadium. It's awful. And, they weren't designed for football either. So the sight lines weren't great. You might, be quite far from the action and so on. So we came to a point in 2001, 2002, where our ownership group really had two different visions for the way forward. One group were saying, look, we really need to cut back on our spending. We need to, this is meant to be a summer league to go into fill NFL stadiums when they're not being utilized in the summer months. And we are being too ambitious in what we're trying to do. Let's scale back. And then there was another group that took exactly the opposite view. No, the original business plan was right. We need to, doubly commit to this. We believe in it so much. We want to get the right players in. We want to invest in new stadiums. And so that came to a head, and ultimately, fortunately, the more optimistic, more aggressive group won out that debate. And then from that moment forward, really, the league began to, we had our first stadium, first in Columbus and then in Los Angeles, a stadium that they still play in LA today. And that really proved the model that these beautiful 25, 30,000 seat stadiums can work and make the team financially viable and provide the right environment for the game. And now, as I said, there's over 20 stadiums all across the United States and Canada. So that model was replicated. And it's a great example of what happens in sports. When when you're a pioneer, you're often told you're crazy. Then people see the success of what you're doing, if you're lucky enough to be successful, and then everybody follows. And sports and business is like that. But sports is quite interesting because it's kind of a test tube. There's not many businesses where you are really tested in the same way so publicly twice a week, constantly all year round, right? So it's an interesting test tube for things that work and don't work. And so I think this aspect of success breeding followers is very strong in football and in sports.
You said about kind of success and then everyone follows you. Beckham joins the league, and obviously Beckham is one of the most known people on the planet. Mm-hmm. To what extent was Beckham the needle mover that you expected for the league? I don't think
David was, changed the entire dynamic, candidly. I mean, it was another step. There were many steps involved here. We started out, for example, with the league in 1996, not really knowing how what our audience was going to be, whether there really was the demand that we believed there was for football, for soccer in the US. I don't know how to use it. When I'm speaking in the US, I always say soccer, but of course soccer is an English word, but from association football. But anyway, what we were trying to do in those early years, we had shootouts, you couldn't have a drawn game. It had to be a result. We did all kinds of things with the rules. We had a clock that was not kept on the field and all of these types of things. Whether they're good ideas or bad ideas, they were not authentic. And so another thing happened in 2001, 2002, which was we moved back to being a part of the world's game in terms of the way we played. So suddenly, the original branding of the teams, which was Tampa Bay Mutiny or, a Dallas Burn or San Jose Clash, all these names went. We returned basically football back to its authentic self, put the rules back in compliance with the FIFA rules. And really the bet was that there was enough of a fan base of people who really were football fans, soccer fans in the United States, that we could rely on that. We didn't have to grow the pie and reach out and take an American football fan or a baseball fan. We had enough. And I think so there were a lot of things that were happening at this time in the league. There was the investments in the new stadiums. There was the return of football to its authentic self. And there were these new investments in players. Not just David Beckham, a lot of development also in player development. A lot of players are also being signed from Central and South America, younger players. But David, of course, made a worldwide splash that we couldn't have replicated in any other way. So it was another significant step for the league. It was a great sign of ambition. And we're seeing it again with Lionel Messi now, of course. But, these things in themselves don't change the whole dynamic. They are steps along a road that is really being driven by demographic and technological changes. The United States is demographically changing. By 2050, 1 in 4 Americans in the United States will be Hispanic, of Hispanic origin. You have the growth in technology and distribution platforms, which means that when we started Major League Soccer in 1996, if you're a 12-year-old kid that's playing soccer in Denver, you had no way to watch European football. You had no way to watch Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi. You were dependent on all your information. You were depending on a 55-year-old sports editor who grew up with baseball to tell you what was important. So you had no information. You had no access to the games. The world's changed. Now, if you're a 12-year-old kid growing up in Denver who's playing soccer on the weekends, you can watch Premier League game before you go out to soccer practice. You can read anything you want about, Harry Kane and what he eats for breakfast. You can watch social media and you watch the team arriving before kickoff, and you're having that experience in common. Not just with your teammates there in Denver, but you're having those experiences in common with the 12-year-old boy in Beijing. So the world is changing dramatically. Football is something that people globally want to watch. It's the world sport, and so we are developing now a globally culturally relevant language that we speak together. And football will be at the center of that.
Can I ask, when you review your time with the MLS and review that and think, what did you do that you wish you hadn't done? And what did you not do that you wish you had done?
I wish I had been a little bit stronger at the beginning about, not Americanizing this sport. It wasn't necessary. I think that was a mistake. So I think a lot of our branding, I was there, remember, as an English person, I was sort of thinking, well, these Americans, they know marketing. I don't want to tell Nike what to do here.
Bold stance to take.
There's a great story. We had the team in Tampa, which was called the Tampa Bay Mutiny. And their logo came out, and it was a bat. And one of our general managers, who was American actually, but he got this issue that we need to be authentic. He said, "But this is a bat, and this is the mutiny. So what's the connection? What's going on here?" And the marketing guy said, "Well, it's a mutant bat." And he said, "Well, mutant and mutiny are two words, but they have totally different meanings." That's how it was in those early days, and you have to realize we got our financing in ultimately, I think, in November 1995. We had to start a league in April 1996, by which I mean signing all the players, hiring the general managers, coming up with team names, stadium leases, broadcast contracts, referees, schedule. Everything that is involved in a league. So we were putting this thing together at an incredible pace. You were talking about, Harry, about how much coffee you drink. We just didn't sleep for 6 months, a year, really, going into that opening game. So there were a lot of things in the launch that we could and should have done differently. I'm not sure the results would have been so dramatically different, though, candidly.
What did you not do that you wish you'd done?
Not too much, honestly. I think we tried a lot of things. I think what would have been good, one of the things I wish we'd done earlier, we created a sister company to Major League Soccer called the Soccer United Marketing. One of the challenges that soccer has had in the United States is that it's not cohesively managed. So you have, the Mexican national team used to come into the US. They would play 5 games a year, 5 or 6 games a year, all done by local promoters with the local beer brand or whatever, sponsoring it. And they would come in and go out of the market. In the summer, you'd have the English teams or the European teams coming in, playing a game or two and leaving. You would have people watching the World Cup on television. You had Major League Soccer, obviously. You had, European soccer that was beginning to be broadcast into the United States. There were the national teams as well and all of their games. None of this was cohesively managed. It was just happening in a haphazard kind of way. And what it meant was it was killing value for everybody, really. And it wasn't really strategically growing the game in the most vibrant way that it could have. And so we formed a company. Again, it happened at this time in 2002 when a lot of things were changing. And in fact, at that time, imagine this, the World Cup final tournament was not going to be broadcast in the United States in English language. It was going to be broadcast in Spanish language, but not in the English language. Now that's unthinkable today. So what we did is we went to our owners and said, let's set up a company, let's buy the broadcast rights, take the risk ourselves, and put it on ABC at our risk, because we cannot have the World Cup not being shown on television in the US. It'll kill, what we're trying to do for the game, for Major League Soccer, for everything. And that company really began to acquire lots of different sports assets after that, and to manage them in a much more cohesive way and grow the value for everybody, but not just the value, the visibility of the game. And that helped to grow what's a very big pie now in the United States. Like people, they ask it less and less now, but they ask a lot, when will soccer make it in America? Well, the reality is it has. It's already there. It's a massive fan base, a very sophisticated, connecting with the sport in lots of different ways, from playing at the junior levels all the way through to watching the World Cup at the other end of the spectrum, but everything else in between. And that pie is growing because of those, what I term demographic and technological changes. That pie will continue to grow. So then for Major League Soccer, really the question is not how do I get baseball fans to be soccer fans? The question really is how do we get a bigger piece of the soccer pie?
Messi seems like the reference point that people require to then look at that and answer exactly that question. Maybe when will it make it?
Scored 2 goals again the other night, last night.
Exactly.
It's incredible. I think it's, was it 7 or 8 goals in his first 3 or 4 games?
But he is basically the greatest player ever. So getting him into the league and obviously the fan base it attracts, particularly when you're talking about the demographics of the US. And you look at the Hispanic population and obviously the Argentinian contribution to that. You look into Miami Stadium, half the stadium's in Argentina shirts. They're there to watch him. But I thought what was really interesting about that, and I don't know what you think of maybe the sustainability of this, but believe what you will, he received offers from Saudi Arabia, new league obviously forming their competition in the same way, run slightly differently to how the others do. Yet you suddenly maybe saw the American corporate juggernaut come in and put together a package and opportunity for Messi outside of maybe what a football club could have done to help give him what was required to batter off the other offer. And Apple's piece of the pie they're supposedly giving him from subscription seems like an absolutely incredible incentive for the whole league to now go and utilize that signing.
So, I think it's a great example really of the collective power of what Major League Soccer can do that no other football league would be able to do. I think that required a lot of commitments on a lot of people's part. First of all, I think it requires commitment on Lionel Messi's part to choose that route. probably, I don't know what all the economics are, but it's not clear that his economics are better in the US and probably carry a little bit more risk. But so it requires him, first of all, to be willing and prepared to do that. Then it requires the local owner of the Inter Miami team, Jorge Mas, the Mas brothers, and obviously David Beckham, to make the kind of commitment that's required from them, which is extraordinary. But then also they leveraged on the power of the collective ownership group. So a lot of the discussion around signing David Beckham or about signing Lionel Messi is about, okay, we're all going to benefit from this. So will everybody contribute in some way or another? The way that this happened with David Beckham was through giving him the right to purchase an expansion team in the future, right? So that's value that the owners collectively are giving up in order to bring David Beckham into the league. And as you've mentioned, I don't know the details, so but I know that it's been reported that Messi has a share in the way that the international broadcast rights revenue will increase as a result of his participation in MLS.
Can I just ask you a stupid question? Why is it an incredible or extraordinary commitment, as you said there, from Beckham and Jorge Mas? It's like, yeah, I'd love to have Messi join the team, and it obviously will accrue value. What's the big commitment on their side?
Well, there's a chunky salary that goes with that as well. So it's not just all, there are some guarantees that have to be given, and that's risk on behalf of the ownership group there. They will have done a lot of modeling, as did AEG when we brought David Beckham in, on what that means for Inter Miami's revenue streams, and how much of that they can cover through all of those those different avenues that teams have to make money on a signing like that. So I don't know. I wasn't a part of it, so I don't know enough about all the economics, but I would be very, very surprised if they didn't take a significant economic risk in bringing Lionel Messi to the United States. Do I think Lionel Messi is a unique player? Probably, to be able to make that look like a very smart decision. Yes, I do, but it's not without risk.
I'd love to see the modelling from the Saudi teams on Kylian Mbappe's 700 million in a year. But that is some creative accounting, isn't it?
Even that was really interesting, because that was the number that was thrown out straight away. And then the next thing, a few days later, well, it was 200 million, and then 500 million would accrue based on, rights successes, sponsorship. So I think you've got to be careful, don't you, with the numbers. It's always difficult.
I think there's an awful lot of lack of clarity, I guess, in how, because there's so much interest and so many false numbers are thrown out, that it actually becomes quite difficult to get to what the real things, how it's really working.
Is it frustrating for you having working on these deals, working on these commitments between clubs and players, and then you see misreported numbers, or not necessarily misreported, but where a payment's over 5 years, it's not up front in that ridiculous large tranche. Is it frustrating?
No. In Major League Soccer, we, in the first years, we did not disclose the salaries of our players. And in the US sports, one of the big negotiating points in a union agreement is the union wants the league to have to disclose everybody's salary. The league does not want that to happen if it can avoid it. Why? Because if I'm an agent and I know, or a player, and I know, this player's earning that, and all that information gives me negotiating leverage in my negotiations. So that's a typical dynamic. And now actually in Major League Soccer, the salaries of all of the players are given to the union, and the union publishes them. So they're known. That's public information.
You mentioned to us, every time in your career you've maybe been somewhere or have the comfort, it's led to a move. So you have the 14 or so years at MLS, and then an opportunity comes to go into the completely different footballing structure that is the Premier League. How did that opportunity come about?
With the Arsenal board, they were keen to bring me on. Danny Fisman was really the driving force. And then Stan, I think people think Stan Kroenke brought me into Arsenal. That's not the case. Stan signed off on it, but really he was the last person to know. So I came into Arsenal. What drove me to do it? I think there's probably a lot of psychoanalysis that go into that. But honestly, I just felt like, I remember when I was newly arrived in England, 5, 6, 7 years old. We were living in Portsmouth, and my dad would take me to Fratton Park to watch Pompey. And I'd be playing also, with my school team and my district team. And I just remember that feeling of the Saturday morning and the excitement I felt when I was a kid. When you work for a league, you're always so balanced. You're balancing all the different interests. You are dealing with a lot of emotion at the team level, but you have to always be very level-headed. I wanted to have that feeling of really visceral excitement on the weekends again. And honestly, that was a big part of what drove me. And my brother, by the way, lives 200 yards from the Arsenal Stadium and is a huge Arsenal fan his whole life. And the thought, to be back with my brother and of course, he just literally didn't believe me until he saw the announcement.
Really?
He literally didn't believe me.
He's the same when I tell him I interview VCs.
Yeah, no, I get very excited. This was a real stress to do the sport. It must have been a really interesting time though, because they had obviously made the move from Highbury to the Emirates in 2006, so a few years before you go. That obviously presented huge opportunity, but I'd imagine from the business perspective and from the role of a chief executive, its own challenges when looking at how to move the club forward but maintain the level of performance expected by the fan base.
So there was a lot happening. I joined January the 1st, 2009. And the first thing was we were in, the property market was in complete crisis. I don't know if you remember back that far, and we were long on property. We had Highbury Square, which was the old stadium, 650 apartments that we owned. And we were now coming to the point where we were going to have to sell them. And the banks were actually saying, hey, listen, we'd like our money. So we had a crisis on the property front. We were one of the biggest property developers in Islington at that time. Then also the club, although it had this incredible history and reputation, of course, fan base and so on, it actually had not really, in my view, and I think in the view of others, geared up as a modern organization. It was really, very, let me give you some examples. We had literally zero HR person. There was no HR director. We had 1.5 people in our commercial sales department. So one person was doing it part-time and the other person was doing it full-time. If you think about a modern football club, there was no legal function at all. All legal was outsourced. So it was very, and the Premier League really has been driven at least, not by the league brand, but by, the clubs and their capability to drive the international growth of their brands and their through that. The league. And so
can I just ask, why was there this kind of lack of structure and professionalization within the org chart of Arsenal, given the immense success that Arsenal, I remember growing up with the Robert Pires and Henri and Ljungberg and Ray Parlour. It's a massive club.
I mean, this is not unique to Arsenal, by the way. So I think football clubs in general were like that at that time. And it was really Manchester United that had got ahead of the curve. They had realized when for everything that is said about the Glazers, the one thing they did realize is, we need to invest, and they invested in, their commercial sales and drove that sponsorship sales, their sponsorship sales revenue globally in an amazing way. And they were the first movers, and really it was the other clubs that then responded. And I was, if you like, brought in as, in part as a way to develop Arsenal's ability to do that. The challenge we had was not just the property market, which we got through. We got through that. The challenge we had was that in order to build the stadium, we had signed long-term commercial contracts. The naming rights for the stadium were sold. The shirt front, the kit deal were all sold on long-term deals, which were necessary. I'm not criticizing those deals. They were necessary in order to build the stadium, but it meant that we couldn't unlock the value immediately. We had to wait, get the club into a better situation where we could really capitalize on the opportunities when that happened. And that happened after we had built up the organization. But building up the organization in the right way took about 3 years really in the end. And then actually when we renegotiated those deals, we unlocked a lot of value.
Yeah. What do those deal negotiations look like? I am Hyundai. I come to you and say, Ivan, I would like to be on your shirts. I'll pay you £100 million.
They can look like that. I think historically...
I'm here to ask the basic questions, Ivan. Okay?
Well, even today, historically, but even today in some cases, the chief executive is the fan and he just wants to do it, right? And that's... so a lot of it traditionally has been relationship-based, and I found that especially in Italy, still today. But actually what's happening in these deals these days is it's much more process-driven. So, potential sponsors are looking for metrics by which they can measure their investments. They want to know that you have, for example, CRM systems, that your fans, that you can connect with them. And so, again, these are things that nobody thinks about, of course, when they're following football. They're thinking about what's happening on the field. But, a football club needs to know who its fans are. It needs to have a single point of contact so that when somebody calls our call center, we know that, they've got a grandson that they bought a kit for in November, that the father has a season ticket, but the wife doesn't, that, all of the different interaction points that they have with the club. And that's what sponsors are looking for, is that type of knowledge and that way of being able to really leverage their investment. And you have to be able to prove that to them in the modern world. Conversely, if you're looking for a sponsor, you don't want to just go to the first person that comes to you and says, I'm interested. So you really have to have the capabilities inside the club to run a global process. And these are global brands now. So you're running a process where you have an analytics department, which is analyzing, let's say, 5,000 companies and working out which are the 500 that make the long list. Then you are putting together marketing packages with all the creative stuff behind that to connect with the right people in those 500 companies. And then that's coming down to 50, if you like, hotter prospects. Then you've got to have the sales team to be able to go in and meet with those 50 and go through the whole pitch about, and you've got analysts behind that talking about the growth of the team, the growth of the league, how they're going to be able to capitalize on their investment. And then finally you get down to, let's say, 2 or 3 that are at the final stage. And then it becomes a negotiation as to real price and the last details. So you can see that in order to really do that well, football clubs they can do it in 2 ways. They can go outsource to an agency. That's simpler in a way, but it costs a lot of money. So you're losing a lot of value. And actually an agency will never tell your story as well as you can tell it yourself. What Manchester United showed the way on was on this process-led sponsorship sales was if you invest in the internal capability, yes, it's an investment in the club, but it will pay off for the club in the long term. And that's what we did at Arsenal.
That's where the balance becomes so interesting, because you've got all of this on your plate, and it's about so much more than what's happening right now. It is the sustainability of the club. But on the other side, you have games maybe twice a week, and a fan base who appreciate the numbers and the scoreboard at the end of those 90 minutes. How do you balance the two within the job of chief executive?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. The other thing that was happening at that time, of course, was we'd had Chelsea come into the market before I arrived, actually, with their spending power. So we saw like Ashley Cole, going across to Chelsea. Arsenal was beginning to be. The other thing that had happened was Arsène had brought in, so many new ideas into English football. And as I said, people will follow success. So suddenly those new ideas were being copied by everybody else and replicated, overseas players coming in and doing really well, nutrition, all of these new things. So the league was becoming a lot more competitive. We had competitors, as David Dean said, parking their tanks on our lawn and firing 20-pound notes at us. And then we had Manchester City coming in as well. So it became, more and more difficult really to compete at the level that we wanted to and that our fans wanted us to. But we were able to maintain a consistent level through that. I think a lot of this is, a lot of the tensions here are tensions. It's a good, healthy tension is between short-term and long-term. There are many things you can do to give yourself a short-term boost or possibility of success, but they come with risk. And so within an organization, you're going to have typically, we had an unusual situation at Arsenal because of Arsène's long tenure, but typically what you'll have is, your coach or your manager who's focused very much on the short term. That's how they're judged week to week, game to game, and they will have the shortest term perspective. Then in a certain model, you'll then have the football director or the technical director or sporting director, whatever you call it, who has, if you like, a medium term, time frame. So he's not the first guy to get fired. He's sort of the second guy to get fired. So he can afford to think, okay, well, it's not just about this week or even this season. I need to think about next season and the season after in the way we're building our contracts, the way we're developing players and giving them opportunities. It's not all about the here and now because I will be judged and, on this medium term. And then the chief executive tends to be the more long-term thinker. He's the one thinking about, well, what happens in 2028, and so not too popular in general, I would say, to be to be at that end of the spectrum, but it's a necessary role. And if you have the balance right between these different dynamics in terms of long-term, short-term interests, because if you only focus on the long-term, you're also screwed because the short term does matter. It does matter what your relationship is with your fan base and how fans feel. And so achieving that balance is really, really delicate. It's about community. It's about feeling. It's really about self-esteem and pride and those types of very fundamental human emotions. So that's incredibly powerful emotions that you're dealing with. And they're like rocket fuel. If they're firing in the right direction, there's just no feeling better. I've lived that with Milan. The unity, the passion, what you can achieve together when all of those things are lined up is incredible. And it's wonderful to be a part of that. At the same time, you're dealing with rocket fuel every day, so it's extremely explosive. And we have a media as well, which is increasingly, troubled, I would say, and trying to achieve its own business ends through firing up those emotions. And so and social media as well now, of course, has also come in. So it's very, very volatile. Now, what happens in that environment is, I think it's not healthy. It's very dehumanizing. And it ultimately leads to a lot of bad decision making, I would say, in football, and by which I'm not talking about now Arsenal or any particular club. I just mean collectively, it's not providing an environment which gives strategic direction and good stability to football. And then we see lots and lots of problems in football. Clubs that try to compete because of all of that kind of chaotic emotion, and end up in bankruptcy and so on.
Can I ask, you mentioned the short term and the kind of longer term mindsets of manager and CEO there. How do transfer budgets work? Like, do you set them for the manager and that's set? What does that process look like between manager and CEO on transfer budget?
Again, it will be different from club to club. At Arsenal, we were running a self-sustaining model. And what that means is that we were investing what we had, but not more than what we had. It was important for us to grow our revenues so that we could reinvest them into the club. So we would do that analysis. Of course, to do the analysis, you have to make some assumptions about what your sporting performance is going to be. If you make more aggressive assumptions, you'll be able to produce a case for spending more money. But of course, if you miss those assumptions, you've then put things at risk for the club going forward. Again, it's this long-term, short-term balance.
Were you more optimistic or pessimistic?
I would say we were, I think the ethos of Arsenal is probably slightly more on the conservative side, but you don't want to be too conservative. So I think we were more or less, we would budget more or less for where we finished, which would be in the top four, but not winning the league. So again, you have to be careful. This is a budget process. It's not an ambition, but it's a way that you budget to make sure that the club is long-term sustainable. So you have to have some sporting assumptions in there because that affects your revenue. Of course, everyone would love to believe they're going to win the Champions League every year, and some clubs, may budget for that, but that carries a high degree of risk. And we can see, if we look around football, look at the issues Barcelona have. If your budgeting's too aggressive, you can run into really big trouble with the football club. I think one of the things we always felt, I always felt it, Arsène certainly also always felt it, was a big sense of responsibility for the club. It would have been easy, I think, for Arsène to say, for example, look, even publicly, and you see many managers do this, if only we spent more, I would be able to deliver to you, the fans, everything you ever dreamed of. And essentially, a lot of managers play that game with the fans, saying, it's those bastards back there that I think Arsène genuinely felt, a sense of long-term responsibility for the club. And so we budgeted, I think, rationally. But, I think what was happening in football over those years was the competitive landscape was changing with Chelsea and Manchester City coming into the equation. And it was becoming more and more difficult for our self-sustaining model to really deliver at the level that our fans wanted. So, winning FA Cups and so on is great. And, those are wonderful moments and great feelings. But obviously what we really wanted was to win the league. Yeah. And that was really challenging.
Before, we've had managers on the show and they talk about how challenging agents can be and how transaction kind of centered they can be. Does that get better or worse in the next few years with the wall of money that is coming harder and harder for football? Does it get better or worse?
Well, look, I mean, I guess it depends if you're an agent or not. I by the way, I'm not somebody that, thinks agents are awful people. I just, or that they shouldn't be doing the job that they do very aggressively and very well for their clients. I'm absolutely not saying that. What I believe is there should be a better structure. And I think, in a better structure, the good agents will do very, very well, just as they do in the United States. And I think the players will actually do better. In the United States, the regulation is really driven by the unions, and I don't see that here. That's what I'm saying. Will it get better or worse? With better regulation, it will get better. With worse regulation or badly enforced regulation, it will get worse. It will continue to get worse. With the new money coming in, the question will be, well, who benefits from all of that money? I don't like the, I'm not a great fan of the development of the game where, it really is just all about money, and that only those that are, prepared to make the biggest losses or, to those people go the spoils. I think football clubs and leagues are extremely big, what we might call brands, okay, in business speak. They're actually quite small businesses. So most of the football clubs, even at the very top level, might be earning 400, 500 million pounds a year turnover. So that's not a big business in relation to the size of their brand. I mean, Manchester United is not Coca-Cola, but it's not a million miles away from Coca-Cola. So what does that mean? It means, first of all, it means that if you look at that as a business investor, that's an opportunity. You would imagine that you could organically grow the revenues of the football club towards the size of its brand and that the future should look very good in terms of growth. There's an issue of cost control, cost containment, which you always have. Basically, where's that money going? It's all going to the players, but okay, that's a separate issue. You can imagine the turnover growing towards the size of the brand. But because it's such a big disparity, there is such a big gap between the size of the brand and the size of the business, in effect, that is being short-circuited. What's happening is that wealthy investors, or even now nation states, are attributing such a value to the brand and the association with the brand that the business losses, or the value of the business, the size of the business, is basically irrelevant. So they can, easily make decisions that, okay, we lose 100 million, we lose 200 million. It's just not the biggest issue in the world. We are associating ourselves with a multi-billion dollar, pound brand, global brand, and the value that we get out of that is so far outweighs a few hundred million here or there, maybe even a couple billion here or there, that it's irrelevant to us. And so that's what I see happening in football. And what that leads to is, an environment in which, money really dominates. I mean, I remember, a time when 20 million pounds, as you said, was a lot of money. Now, we've created an environment where, that's seen as nothing, and you can, it's an insulting bid, and, fans are upset because we're not, this is not healthy. It's not a healthy way for the sport to be developing, and it's very uncontrolled. Now, that might be the future. And that will be probably great for players, even for chief executives. That might be great, but I don't think it's healthy for the game.
Can we shift tack quickly? Because there's another side of it that I'm really interested in that you had on your plate when you were at Arsenal, and that's the succession planning management piece around Arsène Wenger and the most iconic person in the club almost for that time, not necessarily being on the pitch, but in the dugout. As a leader, as the man in charge of those decisions, how do you come to that decision when it comes to looking at the future? Yeah.
So, I mean, a football club is unusual, right, in the sense that the chief executive is not necessarily the most important person at the club. The way that we are structured, you have a board, of course, that you're reporting to, the owner, and then you will have very, very important figures in our club who are on the sporting side. So Arsène, of course, is a giant of the club. And I've always said, the most difficult decision at Arsenal would be not how you replace Arsène, because that would be impossible, but how do you manage the club through a transition whenever that would happen. And it is tremendously difficult because I think when somebody's been at a football club for that long, every piece of the club becomes, imbued with that person's values and ethos. And we at Arsenal benefited from that immensely because Arsène really created the modern Arsenal. But, there comes a time, whenever that is, that you've got to then look at the future. And that involves having a new person, and actually in a modern football club, new people. You hope without damaging the best of those values, but they're going to have their own ideas and, give new impetus and new thoughts to how to push the club forward. It's challenging because you can't really build the bicycle while you're cycling it. And of course, you're going to be cycling it in football every day as hard as you can, pedaling as hard as you can, right up until whenever the finish line is. And the date of when that is uncertain as well. So I think there's some particular challenges in a football context. I think one of the things that I would say business in general suffers from, but I think maybe football in particular, is because you have so many people who are in jeopardy of losing their job, because it is so male-dominated and has a very male-dominated ethos. I think, you have a leadership model that is very much based on the great leader who knows everything. Everything must go to the great leader. Nothing must be done without the great leader. You have people underneath who are petrified that they might lose their job, so become quite defensive about their area. Proximity to the leader gives them security, and conversely, if they feel like they're disconnected from the leader, they don't have such security, and they're very protective of their area because they don't want somebody asking questions about what's happening in their area of expertise. I'm not talking about Arsenal now. I'm talking about in football in general and what I've seen. This type of management model is outdated and inefficient when the world is changing very, very quickly. We can think about different leadership models that exist where there is a lot more collaboration happening, both horizontally and vertically, that are less hierarchical. So it's not that the chief executive or whoever the leader is knows everything at all. Quite the opposite. It's really cultural environment that you create where people feel safe and secure asking questions, asking for help. Men don't even like to ask for directions in the street, right? So in this generally very male environment, very insecure environment, I think there's a lot of behaviors that are not optimal ultimately for good, flexible, modern functioning organization. And I think that question, for example, of, can you help me? I don't know the answer in an organization is tremendously powerful, because when you do that, you've paid a compliment to the person you're asking, which says, I think you can help me. And that's, by the way, is a bond that then forms between us, because you don't forget how valued you felt. But then secondly, you actually help me and you bring a different perspective to the problem that I'm working on. And in a lot of football clubs, you won't get that question being asked enough, because people are frightened of the questions that might be asked. They're frightened to admit that they don't know everything.
Is that not the role of the leader, though? And what I mean by that is, like, it's the CEO often who sets the culture. It's top down. So you can say in the board meeting, I don't know the answer here, or I actually made this mistake last week. How should we think? Like, is that not the leader to imbue that culture top down?
Yes, it is. So you've got to create an environment in which culturally that is happening. And that's one of the big challenges of leadership. And of course, again, in a football club, it's a little bit unusual, right? About who is the leader. You've got a chief executive, and then you've got the sporting side, which is driving so much of the culture in a football club.
And when the brand of the sporting side, in particular a Wenger, a Ferguson, a Mourinho, is so big, although hierarchically they may not be the boss, so to speak, technically, that's a big brand to deal with.
It is. And look, again, I really, I'm not saying this about Arsène Wenger. I want to be totally clear about that. Arsène is one of the most incredible leaders that I have known. And so, to me, he imbues those values. So this is really not about Arsène. I'm talking about football generally, what I see. So what I see is, a lot of this type of defensiveness in the industry. And I think, one of the things that we need to develop is a more progressive leadership style in football. And I think that would benefit the game. And I think one of the interesting things is, if you can do that, if you can create, and I see some football clubs doing this, creating some really interesting environments. If you can create the right cultural environment, then that will lead to success. One of the big learnings for me, just being involved in business really, but also in sports, has been, I used to think that if you're really smart and you really know your subject and you think through a really careful, brilliant strategy, and you follow that strategy consistently, that you will be successful. I was very focused on strategy. I don't believe that anymore. I believe that far more important than strategy is culture. I think the world is changing so fast that your strategy is going to be going to need to be adjusted along the way constantly. And you will not be able to do that well and effectively unless you have the right culture. So I'm not saying strategy is not important. I'm strategic thinker and so on, but I think culture is more important.
Can I ask one final one on this, which is just like, I interview the best leaders in the world, the best CEOs. Arsène is clearly an incredible leader and CEO in kind of his field. What were some of the biggest lessons to you on leadership from watching him?
There have been a lot. I think one is grace. I think Arsène always was generous in his judgments on people. I think Arsène, is somebody who's thoughtful. Many examples of that with players, where there'll be people writing them off or upset with them about things, and Arsène would really think about them more in a human way, and wouldn't give up on people easily, and also had the courage to give people opportunities and to, give them also authority to be able to even make their own mistakes. I think about, young players. Arsène would do that knowing they were going to make mistakes, but, he really believed to his core in giving people a chance. So that kind of generosity of spirit and grace is one thing. The second is just the thoughtfulness. He, for example, after a game, things may have not gone the right way, but he wouldn't speak to the players after the game because, he knew himself well enough to know he was in an emotional place where he might say things there that he would ultimately regret, that wouldn't be the right things or may even be incorrect. So before he would have really any communication, he would go back, he would have a look at the tape in a calm environment. He would relive the game. And often I think he would come to different conclusions and think about different messages. He's a highly intelligent guy who, I've seen him, speaking to the people that do the analytics or the people that do psychology. The level of that discussion is really amazing. And he would listen. He would really listen to what smart, thoughtful people would say. And then, of course, he's got to make his own decisions at the end of that. So I think all of those things, sometimes being a little bit quieter in the way you think about things. Again, you might say it's not traditional football, right? We have the image of the coach shouting and getting the players fired up and knowing everything and telling everyone what they must do. He really wasn't like that. And, you could see a little bit of that in our football even, and his romantic vision of the game was very powerful. I mean, maybe it lost its place in the modern game. I hope not. But, he was looking always for perfection. And I think that was inspirational to people. So this was another aspect of his leadership. It had weaknesses. We wouldn't be prepared for every situation. We wouldn't be, always in total control. But it also had magnificent, brilliant moments that, where it was really football at the best that it can possibly be. And that's what he was always aspiring for. And he never compromised on that.
Can you talk about Milan? Because that's something I feel, just from the sense of, firstly, was hugely important to you and a very special time, but also that showed enormous progress and development in a relatively short amount of time.
Well, the club had been in a mess for quite a while, really. It had not qualified for Europe for, I think, 7 years. It hadn't won the league for 11 years. It was taken over by a New York hedge fund when the Chinese owner of AC Milan was unable or unwilling to meet the debt service, the debt that he had used to buy the club. And so it was really in a crisis point. I remember in one of my first games, our entire hardcore fan base, we were losing 3-0 at home, and our entire hardcore fan base, what they call the Kurva Sud, the ultras walked out during the game. And we were playing with an empty 3 tiers of San Siro at the goal we were trying to score in. The club was losing, about 150 million euros a year, and that was going to have to increase to up to 200 million, inevitably because of the wage bill. They had gone on a big spending spree, and so we had a lot of players on big contracts, and obviously the team performance was still average. So there were a lot of challenges, I would say. Again, we didn't have a commercial sales department. It was really, to the extent we did, there tended to be local deals. So most of the sponsorship deals, 2/3 of the sponsorship deals were local Italian deals, only 1/3 international. And we had a stadium which is incredible and wonderful, and I love it as much as anybody else in the world, but really is very decrepit now. There are areas of the stadium that are even closed down due to safety concerns. There are, if you go to San Siro, make sure you go to the bathroom before you go to the stadium, especially if you're a woman. The disabled access is very poor. There are a lot of aspects of the stadium that are just outdated now. So, this was a set of facts I was presented with, and I arrived not speaking Italian, brought in by a New York hedge fund with great skepticism behind, what a hedge fund is going to be able to do with this Italian club. So it was not a good set of facts. Let's say that.
Did they set a list of goals and objectives for you and with you?
It wasn't, we really weren't, it wasn't so much very specific KPIs. I think what they had decided was they would go for a very chief executive centric model. So there are different ways they could have approached this. They inherited the club not because they had planned to, but because there was a default on the debt, and so suddenly they're in charge of AC Milan. There are a number of different approaches they could have taken. One would be to say, you know what, this thing is losing huge amounts of money. We don't want to be involved in football. We will batten down the hatches, cut everything to the bone, and sell it to the first bidder that comes along, and walk and get out. And to be honest, they probably could have done that, and they probably could have made some quick money that way. They decided they weren't going to do that. They decided what they would do is bring in a chief executive that they would basically give their trust to just turn this thing around. I came in with a lot of problems to address, but I had a really full support from the ownership group in having a look at the organization first of all, and then putting in place the organization we would need, and then delivering on that project. So that meant an entirely new senior management team, for example, moving almost all of the senior management team out and bringing in a new senior management team as a first step, then really analyzing what we were doing on the sporting front, but also on the commercial front, and making sure that those were both lifted to a modern standard. And then we had a lot of work to do on the sporting front in really reformatting the squad. Bear in mind, my time in Major League Soccer as Deputy Commissioner, I was in charge of really all the technical aspects of the league. So that would be the game, including signing all of the players for Major League Soccer. So my background before I went to Arsenal was actually more on the technical side than on the commercial side. I had some commercial functions there, but really it was more the technical side. So in a sense, I was the sporting director for Major League Soccer. Obviously at Arsenal, Arsène was the coach and the sporting director, the manager in the truest sense. Now at Milan, I'm going back to some of those sporting director kind of principles and functions and thinking about, okay, how can we manage these squad contracts? How are we going to be able to bring down the wage bill significantly, because we cannot be losing 200 million a year. But at the same time, we needed to improve the performance. So this was the challenge. That was the challenge. And normally in football, those two things run in lockstep.
What did you do to do that so successfully then?
I think there were a lot of factors involved in that. So, first of all, we brought in a really brilliant top-class scout who specialized really in identifying young players and worked very well with analysts. And then we had an analytical department that we formed, which did a lot of player analysis, statistical analysis on players. And it's really that combination. If you can get that working well, you can do some great things. So we had a scout and an analytical department that worked really well in lockstep. Then we had to choose a sporting director, and I was really impressed with Paolo Maldini and his human qualities with the players. So I think there were a few things that Paolo brought to the project. One was obviously his charisma and his presence and so on, and credibility, if you like. But I think beyond that, although it was new to him, he hadn't done this job before, was the relationship he was able to create at Milanello between the players, especially these young players who needed, if you like, a father figure who could give them a sense of belief. And Paolo did a great job with that. And so, we began this process. It wasn't easy because that first year we were selling or letting even go for free some of our top players and certainly some of our most expensive players. And the fans were skeptical. I wasn't speaking Italian yet. Our owners were a hedge fund. The team was, not good. And we were telling them, we're going to sign some young players that you won't have heard of, but we believe they can be good.
Do you feel that pressure and intensity and heat in the boardroom when you are having the local press and the local media really criticizing you? We had Steve Pagliuca on, who owns Atlanta and the Boston Celtics,
Mm-hmm.
and he was like, you do feel it and you do hear it. Did you?
Of course you hear it. But I think one of the things that over time you learn, especially if you're in the business side like I am, over time you learn that you have to do what you believe in and tune that out. I say sometimes it's like being a pilot of an airplane, that you're in a very bad crosswind and you have to land this plane safely, and you have, the entire all of the passengers who have never flown a plane screaming at you, telling you what to do. You have to focus on what you think is right. And then you have to have the ability inside the organization to have people believe and pull them with you. And then you just have to do your best to tune out everything else. Because, in the end, it's not a criticism of people who are outside the club, but the reality is there is so much misinformation that so much of what they're basing what they think on is just not accurate. It's the people really inside the heart of the club that understand it and know the challenges and what's really going on and what you're trying to do. And it's those people you have to have believe. If they don't believe, then you can't. This is not a solo mission, right? Mm-hmm. You're doing this all together.
We spoke before about bringing transparency to what is quite an opaque world in terms of the business of sport, right? Podcast name. What do you think is the biggest misconception or opacity there is between fans and media and the world, and what actually happens inside a sports team?
Oh, what's the biggest one? I mean, there are a lot. I always found surprising, really, was that people, because their emotional connection with the club is so strong, when things are not going the way they want them to, they believe the people at the center of it, whether it be the players or the coach, or even, nowadays it seems like the chief executives are part of all of this, don't care. And just nothing could be further from the truth. You would have, when you're in the center of a club, you are living that football club with your whole life for years and years, in many cases. And there, that's everything. that you care about. Outside of your family, that's everything that you care about, and trying to make that work. Look, I'm sure they exist. I'm sure there are owners who just don't care, or there are, I don't think there are executives that I've met that don't care, but maybe they exist. Maybe there are coaches that don't care. I've never met one. Maybe there are players that don't care. I've never met one. I think, again, a lot of the emotion, a lot of the negative emotion is really stoked up a lot these days because in a very dehumanizing way, because of the way modern media is, because of social media, and you want some way to express your anger and frustration at the blows to your own self-esteem that you felt you're suffering. And this is not just in sports, by the way. I see this, across many, many different areas. So you end up dehumanizing people actually who care very, very much, and imagining them in ways that their friends and the people that know them, would never recognize them. And so the discourse, the narrative, the thinking process becomes so simplified and so black and white. And I actually think it's not just in sports. I mean, I think we see this across the political spectrum as well, right? Where it becomes harder and harder actually to have good discussions about the issues, because people are just taking extreme positions of black and white. This person is good, that person is bad. And we're not talking to each other in the way we would, frankly, if we were sitting down and having a meal together or a beer together. Face to face, people are different. And we're losing that. We're losing that face to face time. And that's leading to less and less understanding, and more and more kind of destructive behaviors, I think.
With the fan bases, did you then find ways to communicate, recognizing that maybe you had to, and talking about Milan specifically, to people or groups of people sitting at the top of the club who weren't what they were used to? Were there specific ways you would communicate with them then to try and ensure that they understood the journey you were taking them on and what it would look like, hopefully, if your vision came?
Yeah, I think, I think what's really important always as a leader is to be authentic. And so I think I've always done that internally, including at Arsenal. I think I learned something new in Milan. Italian football, I think one of the really interesting things about my career as I reflect on it is I've looked at football from a league administrator position where you're kind of in a neutral place. I've looked at it in the English context, which is, the Premier League and everything that's associated with the Premier League, but a lot of process and so on. And then you go to the Italian context, which is different again. It's a different way. You're moving to the club side, very different from the league side, but also very different between different football cultures. And so, in Italy, they are looking and experiencing the sport in an even more emotional way than they are in England. And so I think what I learned from that perspective is, if you like, internal authenticity, that I was too afraid, I think, to bring that externally in England. I felt that, Arsenal was, kind of a very stable, never complain, never explain type of place. And I was very respectful of that. With Milan, I was much more communicating on an emotional level directly with the fans. So that involved, in a way, exposing your vulnerabilities publicly. And I think that happened in a few different ways. I had cancer while I was there as well. So that was one aspect of that. So, but just
was that public? Sorry.
Yes, yeah, it was public, and I actually never considered not making it public.
Yeah.
And so all of those experiences, just opening myself up publicly a little bit more, and learning how to speak Italian was a very important part of that. Those really, I think, helped our fans understand that I cared, that we cared, and I was very, very honest about the journey we were going to go on, and very specific about the journey we were going to go on together. And I have to say, I have a really special relationship with the Milan fans. I've had some incredible, not just moments of support from San Siro, but also just personally, if I'm walking around Milan, you can feel the connection. People will forgive you a lot if they know you care. Yeah. And I think sometimes as leaders, we make the mistake, or I have made the mistake, of not fully understanding that. Because I know how much I care. I don't need to, I felt like I don't need to explain that, but actually you need to show that.
It's interesting because it's great to hear that you think that comes from the personal side as well, because I think quite a lot of the time we probably look at it and think they were back in the Champions League and they won Serie A with you there, and therefore that love and gratitude is performance driven, but actually there's a recognition beyond that.
Look, I mean, had we not been successful, it would be different, right? So it's difficult to separate out in the same way as it's difficult to say, this person is responsible for this and this person's responsible for that. In the way that people want to. They want to neatly compartmentalize things. The reality of life is just not like that, right? So it's a lot of different elements that make the package. It's the way Arsène had a great saying, which I really loved, actually. He said, it's not about the players. It's about what happens between the players. And I think, teams are like that, and leadership is like that, and situations are like that. So what was happening was a lot of different things. So we brought in Ibrahimovic. So here's this, that time I think he was 38-year-old, figure that we all have an image of. And we put him with these 20-year-olds. We were the youngest team ever to win the Scudetto. And we had Ibrahimovic and Giroud, at the top end of it. And so you can imagine how young the others were. And it just really worked, beautifully. So when people say, was bringing Ibrahimovic the key to turning around Milan? I say yes. And then they say, was bringing in Maldini the key to turning around Milan? I say yes. Was having analytics the key to turning around Milan? Yes, all of them. They can all be true. And I think, I don't know, if you took out one element or another, would all of the good things that happened have happened? I don't know, honestly. But it was the combination of all of those things that made these special moments. So Milan fans call it the most beautiful Scudetto ever. And it really was. And there were a lot of other things related to that. We had COVID, so we were shut down. So when we had our trophy celebration, that season was the first time when we had fans back. We'd come back from COVID. We'd been told that our young team couldn't perform in full stadiums because they'd feel the pressure too much. So we'd been written off. Juventus, had fallen away, but we were competing against Inter right to the last game of the season. So it was going to be, the city was going to be blue and black or red and black. And nobody knew until that last game. And we hadn't won the championship for 11 years. And if they won, they were going to get 20 championships and a second star, right? And if we won, we were going to get 19, and we'd be 19 each. So there was a lot tied up, and we won. And so all of those things, it was like a perfect storm of emotions. And I think also the fact that we had this young team and we'd recreated this feeling with the fans just meant that it was phenomenally powerful. Those moments, and days really after the championship win and the parade on the bus, those are things that you just, they live with you forever. And now my connection with the Milan fans is, it's amazing. I mean, it's really, really a wonderful thing to have in my life, and I'm so happy and grateful for it.
How's it been then, leaving and managing the change?
Well, it felt to me as if this was just a wonderful arc. It really just felt like it was the perfect time. Things was in such a beautiful place that I would never want to spoil that. I had been through a lot, and it was a very intense 4 years, professionally and personally. And so I just felt like it was the right time to step aside. I'm always going to have that bond with Milan. I'm always going to have that bond with the fans and with the club. But it felt like the right time for me personally to take a break. During my time at Arsenal and Milan, I mean, I literally didn't have a weekend off. I virtually didn't have a vacation. So, I gave up a lot of family time very selfishly. And so it's been very, very nice for me just to be able to reconnect with my wife and my kids, but also, my parents who are both still alive, and spend some good quality time with them, and other relatives as well. I went to visit my sister in New Zealand. So it's been an incredibly special time for me to be able to just, take a break and try to work out what I might want to do next.
Can I be incredibly unprofessional and just ask, is your wife incredibly patient?
Yes, she is.
Just like every weekend for like 20 years and every night and every day.
She is. But she's also, we were very happy in Los Angeles. And then, I kind of dragged her to New York when the league started, Major League Soccer. And then I dragged her to London again, and then to Milan. And on each stage of that journey, she's not just accepted it, she's really embraced it. So, she's loved everywhere we've lived, has become completely involved in every move and in both of the teams. I mean, I saw Jack Wilshere this week, and my wife literally, still talks about sweet little Jack, and he's grown up now, but so she gets close with the players and with, following the Arsenal results still and all of those things. So it's been, I'm very, very lucky, very lucky.
Quick fire round.
Let's do it.
You go first, bro.
Who have you learnt the most from within sport?
Don Garber, the Commissioner of Major League Soccer. I think Don is just an incredible guy who's done an incredible job, and on a personal level as well as a special person.
If you could call yourself up the night before your wife had your first child and give yourself some advice, what would you say to yourself?
I would say you don't have to go to every away game.
I'm used to business. I was like, is that a metaphor for business? Oh no, it's real. It's real. I love that.
What's the most iconic sporting memory you've been involved in?
It's been the Scudetto celebration in Milan. I mean, that's, the images don't capture what that day was like. We had the entire city shut down. We couldn't move the bus. The buses couldn't move through the people. It took us 5 hours to travel about a mile. We ended up in the Piazza del Duomo, which is the center of town. Anyone that was there that day will never forget it for the rest of their life.
When we look at the enterprise value of sports teams today, it's just up and to the right and up and to the right. Is this bubble like economic environments, or is this a sustaining value creation landscape?
I mean, a wise man once said, something that can't last forever won't. But having said that, I think football is the global sport. I think the world is continuing to open up. New technologies mean that it's more and more accessible. We have a common cultural global language. And so while it can't go on forever, I think it can go on for a very long time. I think there's an awful lot of value that still has not been tapped into. And the question will be not whether football will continue to grow and thrive. It'll be who are the primary beneficiaries of that.
How do you manage the pressures that come with the professional and the personal in sport? And do you feel it is the same as what some of the players have to handle?
Yes, I think it is the same. I think you have better techniques when you're in your 50s than when you're in your 20s. I think we try to give the players a lot of support in managing that. And there are a lot of things we do to help with that. Pressure and stress can be unhelpful for a player's performance as well as their well-being. I think the same is true for a 58-year-old executive. So, for me, it's simplifying life as much as possible so that we remember the things that are important, and it's not all football. I think one of the perceptions of people is that they don't care enough. I think the reality is you care too much, and that can be unhealthy. So, spending quiet time with my wife and with my family, who know who I am, is really important. And also being involved as much as possible in things that have not just nothing to do with football, but I would say nothing to do with, the same piece of your brain. So, for example, I paint or I play the drums. Those that are using completely different aspects of myself, which just take me away from everything.
I think that's such a nice note to end on. I was going to ask another kind of transactional commercial question, but I think that's the loveliest note.
I would just add finally to it on that, because I wanted to say what next for you then. Do you have plans? Or
I don't know. I have an idea which I'm thinking about, which will be really interesting. But I'm really trying to be patient with myself. I think, the biggest challenge actually is to allow your brain just to unscramble a little bit, especially, in football. A year is a long time in these positions. It really, I think only people inside the game will truly understand that. It's interesting when I meet football people, and I've done that a little bit this week in London. There's a real mutual respect there and understanding of what we all, are living. So I need to unpack a lot of that. And then, ideally what I would do is give that the necessary time, but I can already feel, my own impatience pushing against that. So I don't know.
This has been such a joy to do. Thank you so much for joining us, and I've absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure, guys. Thank you.